Welcome to the next lesson. Okay. In the last lesson, we talked about basically the coming out of the Dark Age, Greek colonization, the reestablishment of polises, where now we're starting to see some very powerful cities come about because of population explosion and because of getting, very wealthy from trading cash crops like olive oil. So in this lesson, though, we're going to be focusing, in this lesson and the next lesson, we're going to be focusing more on the two biggies, Athens and Sparta. This doesn't mean these are the two biggest ones ever. If we go through all of Greek history, you do have some other cities that definitely have prominence over time. But in just the simplicity of this class, these are the two big ones for a lot of different reasons. For one, for a lot of time, these two were the big dogs at the height of Greek power. Take very opposite looks at how to look at things around them, how to establish government, how to run their society, and things like that. And so as we go through these two, Athens and Sparta, one of the things I'd like you to hopefully have in the back of your mind is, okay, that is a lot like our society, and I hope your mind then goes to the question, well, did we copy that from them? Well, I can tell you right now, in many ways, yes, but also in some ways, no. When I say no, we're also running into a couple things we'll talk about to where no, there's certain aspects of Athenian society and Spartan society we're definitely not going to do that. So I'll point some of these out, but just have this in the back of your mind as we go through this. So that being said, just introducing the two. So I already talked about them being two of the more powerful ones, and I will say this as well. I'll show a map of this a little bit later on, but at one point, all of the rest of Greece kind of makes a decision, which of these two cities do we follow? Do we follow Athens or do we follow Sparta? We'll talk about that in a much future lesson when we get to a war called the Peloponnesian War. So, by the way, that's a war between these two. So, we're going to focus on Sparta first, then we'll do Athens in the next lesson. But just to introduce both of them in a basic way right now, looking at Sparta, this is a term that I use. I've seen it used other times in describing Sparta. I've seen so many different ways of describing Sparta, and I try to use the one that was the most simple way to do it, a military commune, meaning that the state is the most important thing. Everybody's duty, every Spartan's duty in the city of Sparta was to essentially make sure the state was doing well, to the sacrifice of basically everything else. Hence the term commune, all for the community, all for the state. And it was directly based around the military. So with Athens, we get the very opposite look of that with the term democracy. Now, we talked about democracy last time, where the idea that the people have the ultimate power. But you get much with Athenian democracy, you get this idea more of like an individualistic sense, like each individual person, at least if you're a guy, we'll talk about that when the next lesson we get to Athens, at least a guy born in Athens, that you have power, you have a say in the world around you and what you think is important. So, and that's very different. In Sparta is this idea where there is no sense of an individual, there is no sense that you can do whatever you want. You have to do what the state needs you to do, or you don't belong. Athens is basically this idea of, you can be your own person, you can think for yourself, and you should have a vote in how the world, how things are how our society is going to be run. That's the basic way I can introduce both of these, and I hope you're getting the idea. Those are polar opposites of each other. Something that is compared many times when we talk about Sparta versus Athens. In many ways, this isn't true all the way around, but it does give you some sense, if you were at least aware of the Cold War in the last century, in the 1900s, post-World War II era, between the United States and the Soviet Union. You kind of have that sense here with Athens versus Sparta. Just very different ways of looking at the world around you, very different ways of treating your citizens, very different ways of looking at what, say, rights of the people are and things like that. Just polar opposites. I hope that at least is a way to help out in just explaining where we're going to be going here, because they are very different from each other. So starting with Sparta. First off, we're going to explain what their government is like, just how they set up their society. Then we're going to go into the history of how they get to this point. So just right up front, The guy that's basically given the credit for establishing the Spartan way of life, this militaristic way of life, and also this idea of just getting rid of all other things that could get in the way and just focus on the state and the military and survival, you could almost say, is a guy named Lycurgus. For instance, one of the stories that is fun to me, and I believe this is in Plutarch's Lives. It's a book about a lot of ancient people that have been very influential throughout time. But, one of my favorite stories is he did not like the focus on money, basically. He didn't like the idea of just having small coins and things like that, and that people would, focus on that. So he decided to change money from small gold coins to kind of like giant ingots, like metal ingots that are very heavy to carry around. And what this did is basically he changed the money system. Everybody was like, I don't want to carry around metal ingots. Like, yeah, you want this burger? That's a modern example, but you want to go to McDonald's and buy a burger? You don't give them $1 for that $1 burger. You give them this big metal bar. Basically McDonald's wouldn't want to take that big metal bar, and you wouldn't want to be carrying it. So it's like, hey, how about I trade you something else instead of that? Are you okay with not using money? Because he made money very cumbersome. So a lot of people look at that and say, man, you're really dumb, Lycurgus, for doing that. You kind of ruin your economy. And a lot of other people look at Lycurgus and say, hey, you did it. You were able to get rid of greed in your society. Man, that's hugely debatable and arguable. I'm not going down that road right now. I kind of want to, but because it's a fun one. But that's one of the stories that I like. That I shouldn't say I enjoy telling about Lycurgus to kind of give you his mindset in the way he sets up his society. So, but when we get, I don't want to go through too much of it. But at the very top of Spartan society, they have kings. So you could say, well, they're a monarchy. But they have two kings, a dual monarchy. Okay, are you seeing why I said I called them a military commune earlier? Just right off the bat. It's kind of confusing just to assign them a certain one of those words or Greek forms of government that we talked about in the last lesson. But they have two kings. But their power is also limited. Something that we'd like to see, king's power limited. They don't necessarily make decisions, but they do lead the armies. So, yeah, their decisions, like in a time of war, Spartan kings, they're in charge of everything because they're running the army. If you're at war, the military is everything. Yeah, there you go. But when it comes to just policies and just what we're going to do at home, domestic policies, economic policies, and things like that, it was left to an assembly of veteran soldiers of the age of 30. Basically, if you're 30 years old and you're still alive in Spartan society, then you automatically get to join this group. This is both viewed as aristocratic and oligarchic at the same time, where you have people that definitely prove themselves to be better than everybody else because they're still alive at this point in this very militaristic society. We'll talk more about why they'd still be alive at this point, or maybe why they'd be dead at this point, and we get more into the social aspect of things with their society. But it is a smaller group of men that does this. Now, something I do like to put at this point, at least explain at this point, is if you do make it to age 30 and you're a guy, then you're assigned a wife. Because like I said earlier, in Spartan society, it's not about what you want in life. It's all about continuing the state. And they would actually view essentially marriage and kids as just a way to enhance the state, to make it better. And the best way I can put this is like they were breeding horses. Like, hey, this guy's an awesome soldier. He does awesome. This girl, she is an amazing athlete, and she's proven herself to be just wonderful. If we can get those two together, their kids are going to be this just supreme super soldier or super mother type thing that will keep Spartan society going with each other. So you did not have that choice of essentially who you wanted to be with in Spartan society. Who you were with was completely based off of how can Spartan society continue. So, now with all of that said, and just how they run their society, this is not my saying, by the way. I found this, and I was laughing a bit. So I like to put it in this PowerPoint in this lesson. I'm not going to test you on this. There's not going to be a question that says, what type of government was Sparta's government. You have to memorize that thing. But it's funny because they had elements of everything. It was democratic in a way where if you're over 30 years old and a guy, you could vote in that assembly. It is also oligarchic because usually that group was a little bit small. Timocratic means that, well, in order to be part of it, you had to have land, although I forgot to mention, but hopefully you're reading it there. When you're assigned a wife, you're also assigned land with slaves on it. I'll talk about that later. By the way, slavery for the Spartans was different than most of the other Greeks. Again, talk about that in a little bit. Most on the next slide, actually. So, and then you have this monarchy idea, or the dual monarchy with the two kings. So they took a lot of different elements and just smushed it together and saying, this is how we're going to deal with this. This is the society we're going to have. And it seems confusing, yes, but when it boils down, it is fairly simple. Hence, I like to use the term military commune in the end. Since everything was focused towards the military and making sure that was good, then everything else we talk about, like, okay, guys over 30, yes, you're assigned a wife, yes, you're assigned slaves, yes, you're assigned land, you have to be this age to vote and things like that. It's all focused to one thing, so hence it makes it more simple. I hope I'm explaining it well that way. Anyways, moving on, getting more into their history. So first off, where they're located. Probably should have talked about this beforehand, but Sparta is located, well, hopefully you see my pointer, right there. So that is Sparta. That's their location. So, and the Spartan area, well, mostly all of Laconia, which is that darker red or pink, that's considered like the area that they control. It wasn't always that way. They did have to spread out in the beginning, and there's a lot of, how do I put this? It's not pure fact, but it's believed that the Spartans actually started off as a people, as a Doric people, those early invaders that settled in this area, and then over time actually got picked on a lot by their neighbors. That whole war season thing we talked about earlier. They lost a lot, and they ended up having to essentially give away a lot of their people as slaves. Again, how do I put this? What I'm telling you right now is more of the speculation side of things, mainly because of what I'm about to talk about next. Because the Spartans changed things up when it comes to slavery. Most all of the ancient world and early slavery a lot of times came down to two things. You're either a prisoner of war, so therefore you're a slave, or you become you go into what's called debt slavery. It's almost like you sell yourself into slavery because you owe a major debt. The Spartans are these people that come, well, how do we put this? They're slaves, who we call helots. This is a lot like the slavery that we see, say, in the American South in the first 100 years of this country, where they are considered property. They are not considered people. Not going to get into right now talking about how bad of a thing that is for the United States to have, especially, and how hypocritical it was when we say we're a land of the free. But you could almost say it's a bit hypocritical of the Spartans way back when. It's like, well, that's not the way slavery worked. Why did you do that? So again, the thought process is that since they had to give away a lot of people kind of into slavery because they lost a lot of their wars, supposedly, this would be like Dark Age times we're talking about, since we don't know much about them. At least leading into the Dark Ages, like 9th century BC type thing. That once they do start winning a bit and kind of establishing more control, that, well, they just took anybody they conquered or beat. It wasn't just like, hey, we'll beat you next year. It was like, we beat you, and so therefore we take you over. And we see this very much so when they have a war with their neighbors called the Messenians. If you look over here where my cursor is, that whole area is called Messenia. It's a major war about the 7th, 8th century BC between the Spartans and them. And when the Spartans win this war, they completely subjugate all of those Messenians to become helots, slaves to the Spartans. Again, why they felt like they needed to do this, not sure, because this wasn't done in the other Greek city-states. Like, there had to have been something there that was like, we need to make these people slaves. And it's believed that it wasn't done out of just pure malice, like the idea like we must lord over you and we're going to own every person on earth. It's most likely had something to do with survival as well as vengeance. That's more of the things are the way are looking like. We can't survive unless we have our military in place because we keep getting beat. So if we have a professional military where our men are not in the fields plowing, plowing for the next planting season and harvest season, but they're actually focused on war day in and day out, well, we need someone to farm, so let's have our slaves do it. But we need to keep our slaves in line, and we also have to make sure we have a military that can fight off everybody else. I hope I'm explaining this well. I feel like I'm doing not as great of a job, but it basically comes down to this. The Spartans form a militaristic society mostly because of their slaves and the fear of getting attacked from outside. So they needed to make sure that they had a military that could both subjugate and keep their slaves in line, as well as fight off any city-state coming at them. And they knew that probably a lot of the city-states would probably want to get vengeance on them for what they're doing. It was like, how dare you, Sparta, for doing this? Essentially having this slave state. So, again, I hope I explained it well. I just want to explain that one more time. They're militaristic because they're afraid of their own slaves, and they're afraid of being attacked at the same time. That would be very destructive for them. So, that being said, what did they do to create their militaristic state? This whole video, I've been saying they're a militaristic state. So, we've looked at their government. We've looked at why they decided to create a very militaristic state to become arguably the most militaristic state of all time. That can be argued, but they're definitely up there. But what they did is they completely changed the way they look at things, and this partly is also what Lycurgus does. Not all him, but partly him. He says, you know what? We need to get rid of this idea that you are you, and we need to institute this idea that you are part of the state and that you live for the state. So one of the things I looked at was like the family. Mom, dad, son, daughter type thing, and says we can't have that. We need to look at this as the state is your mother and your father, and everyone is its children. The only reason you have kids is to keep people within the state. You have kids to make sure your mother and father, the state, meaning Sparta itself, can continue. So therefore, they completely change this idea of what the family is. And because now they get rid of this idea of the family, by the way, you can't get rid of this completely, and we definitely see that in records about Sparta and stories about Sparta, where you still have some familial stuff like, well, that is my son, I birthed him, that type of thing. But that's not the way we think about it today, nor do most of civilizations throughout history think about it. And because they have this thought process that, in the end, Sparta is your ultimate mother and father, you can have things like what I'm about to explain happen and seem normal, be okay. Like to our society today, this would not be normal or okay. But we're going to talk about what happens with boys and with girls, because they're both considered actually very necessary for the state. You need both to make mother and father, Sparta, do well. So first off, when a child is born and they're a boy, remember, they're born to parents who were assigned together. Maybe they love each other, maybe they don't. From what we understand, they didn't really, because dads usually weren't there. Dads were off in the military doing stuff, whereas or off with their buddies all the time, because that's all they've been used to all life. And there's a lot of separation between men and women in Spartan society. So the women are at home, kind of raising the kids. Dad comes home long enough to just have a kid, basically. And so she's raising these kids, and the boys at age 7 are taken away. And the best way I can explain this, to keep this as simple as possible, is like an elementary military school. So these boys are taken away for that, and the moms know this is going to happen. Like, I think about this as like, man, like knowing the moms I've known in my life, whether it's my wife or my mom or just all the women I've known, and how much they love their kids. This would not fly. Somehow it worked in Sparta. Like I said, they had to have had a different mindset. But the boys were taken away at age 7, and the moms are usually like, "Yes, here's my boy." I imagine maybe you had a mom that was like, "Please don't take him," but they'd be taken anyways. I'm assuming. I don't know any stories like that, but I'm assuming you could have that. But they were taken away and sent to this military elementary school. So didn't mean to bring that up just yet. While in that military elementary school, the basic idea was, how do I put this? Kind of build up a mentality that would make you a good soldier. That's the whole idea of it. And again, to make things a little bit simple, the best way I can explain this military elementary school is like all-day recess. Like you're off in the wilderness playing with your buddies, doing whatever you want. The thing is that you do get a bunch of kids that die during this situation. Sometimes a kid will be really mean and brutal and bully another kid and maybe even kill him. The thing is that the bully is not punished. The punishment is the fact that the kid died, meaning that it was that kid's own fault that he died. If he's going to die at age 7, 8, 9, 10 years old because he couldn't really defend himself or he just didn't have what it took, well then the state looks at that as, well, it's good that he died off at that point. He was going to be a weak person when he grew up anyways, and it's better to get rid of him now. Like, if you're hearing this and you're like, this is messed up, yeah, according to the way we think today, this is incredibly messed up. But it's the way the Spartans thought. Now, if you're a kid and you're still alive by age 12, then you move to what I like to call Spartan Military High School. And you're there from anywhere from age 12 to upwards maybe, usually 18 to 21 years old, depending. And I'll explain why in a second. So there is where you get more of the schooling in place. So whereas military elementary school is more like all-day recess, military high school is where it is like a school. You are now much more regimented. Like instead of going off and just playing all day, now you're actually learning to march with each other. You're learning to trust each other. You're learning skills. You're learning. You're being educated, learning to read and write. You're learning mathematics, physics, and things like that. And of course, almost all of it's focused towards war. Spartans get a bit of a bad rap, especially from their neighbors like the Athenians, saying, well, we're the smart ones and you guys are dumb. You're just a bunch of basically big, strong, brute morons. Whereas the Spartans were actually proved to be incredibly smart themselves. They understood that they needed to have a certain amount of education in place to do well on the battlefield. So, anyways, the thing is that even during this whole time, as they spar, as they fight, as they march, and as they go through all these crazy things, you still have a bunch of kids that will die. And it was viewed that if you died, it was your fault. You died on accident in a sparring practice, your fault. You died because you fell off a cliff or something like that. I don't know, like you accidentally misstepped. It's your fault. It's not anybody else's fault. And it's better that you're gone because you won't make Sparta weak. And this is the way they're training these ultimate soldiers. But one of the most important things they are training to, and I know I haven't made it sound like this as much, but during this time they also are trying to get them to trust each other, to always be able to rely on the guy next to you. But that's the idea. If you're still alive, especially by the time you graduate from this and become a full-fledged soldier, then you know that the guy next to you is going to be, well, you can trust him to hold his own, that he is an exceptional warrior, and you can trust him to make sure that he has your back type thing. So once you graduate, you're put into full-time. If you're still alive, you're put into full-time duty and full-time service. What am I thinking? I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I wanted to go over just a couple things that were kind of expected but odd. So there was a bunch of things. I'm just going to talk about two of these because some of the things get a little bit way off basis, and I don't think is necessarily appropriate for a school situation. If you're already thinking I'm talking about things a little bit like messed up to talk about in school, well, just know it gets more messed up. But I'm not going to go over that stuff right now in this lesson. But here's two things that definitely be on the messed up side that I am going to talk about. First off, it was, at least we have stories about how young men, once they reach that military high school, would be expected to show qualities that went aside from the idea of regimentation and taking orders and doing what you're told. And that is the idea of knowing what to do when you're not, like, how do I put this? To be stealthy, you know. They understood that one of the most important things of having military is having scouts, having people that can basically move around undetected and scout out enemy positions and things like that. So one of the things that was implemented I shouldn't say implement, this was not implemented, it was just expected, is that you're supposed to basically escape, run away from the school for a night or so and go steal something, like a loaf of bread or whatever. And the idea was if you could go steal something and make it back without getting caught, you're applauded. Your teachers and fellow students would applaud you. Well done. You were not caught. But if you were caught, if someone found out that you'd done this, or found you out as you were doing this, then when you got back, you'd be beaten mercilessly, maybe even killed. I don't know. And again, your fault if you die type thing. But the idea is they're not being beaten, they're not being punished because they went and stole something. They're being punished because they got caught. And that, again, to us, that sounds incredibly messed up. And one of the things that also was expected of young Spartan boys, basically these teenage boys, is that you cannot graduate until you have gone out of the school without being caught, not being caught, and killed a helot, killed a slave. And again, not getting caught in the process. And you're applauded if you do so successfully, beaten and made fun of if you fail. Again, very messed up compared to the way we think today. God, messed up to the way most civilizations would think throughout most of time. But to them, this was what they felt like was needed to just have this very ultra-militaristic state. Okay. Now, just a few more things. Oh, yes. I was going to talk more about the guys, but since the next slide is about the girls, let's move on to the girls. Now, we just talked about what a guy's life is like, and hopefully we can kind of put two together. Once they get through their full active duty, by the time they get to age 30 and they're still alive, if they don't have a wife at that point, which a lot of times you would, then you're definitely assigned a wife. But now we get into this idea of the girls. Well, with the girls, ironically, in this type of atmosphere, this situation where it's viewed like, man, nobody really has any freedom. You're told what to do your whole life, and your whole life has to do with the state. Well, women actually inadvertently were quite free. Maybe because the guys weren't there to tell them what to do all the time. They're the ones that actually had control over the land. They're the ones that had control over what was going to be farmed. They had control over the slave population in many cases, telling the slaves what to do. They, of course, raised the next generation. They actually had a lot of power and a lot of freedom in this not very free society. Again, very ironic. So, but girls were expected to make sure that they were good in one specific area, and that was athletics. I haven't put it up here, but here's the basic idea of how women are viewed in Spartan society. Even though I just explained how inadvertently they're actually fairly free compared to most ancient societies in general, but their whole role in Spartan society is fit women make fit babies, meaning if you're very in shape, you will have very in shape kids. You'll be able to continue that militaristic state with the best soldiers ever, like breeding horses, like I said earlier. So when girls were raised, they didn't go off to any organized school like the boys did, and they stayed with their moms until it came time to be arranged a marriage. But basically, their whole day was kind of like, I can't really say like all-day recess. In a way it was, like little girls growing up, you can almost say it was like all-day recess. I imagine they had chores and things like that and had to learn discipline. But we know that a lot of their time was spent doing like track and field stuff. They go and wrestle each other. They go race each other. They compete in many ways. And you can definitely see which girls were much more athletic and able to compete and win and things like that versus others. And that would definitely be looked at by the elders and say, all right, she needs to get married to that soldier who's definitely proved himself on the battlefield, and therefore we're going to have the super soldier kid born out of them. If it's a boy, if it's a girl, then she'll be the best baby maker around to basically marry off later on. Like, I know this sounds odd, but that was viewed equal. Being someone who could basically have the children and someone who could protect society, the women have the children, the men protect society, were actually viewed equally important in Spartan society. And it was actually said, it's been said, I've only heard this a few times, I'm going to say a few times, every time I've learned about Sparta, this has only been pointed out about 2 or 3 times, and I've done a lot of research on Sparta. So again, whether other sources that I've looked into just didn't want to mention this, but I like to mention this because I find it interesting and it helps it kind of explain Spartan society more, is that the only people allowed to have a tombstone in Sparta were men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth. Otherwise, no. So, whether true or not, that definitely gives you the idea of what Spartan society was a bit like. So, now, that picture I just brought at the very bottom is something I like to point out, that this is always pointed out when we talk about Sparta. That when it comes time to graduate, that your birth mom will come and essentially give you your shield as this rite of passage. And it is said, we don't know if this is really true or not, but it makes for a good story. It is said that their birth mom would then tell you, with this shield or on it, which means you'll either come back with the shield victorious or on the shield dead if you lost the battle, if you guys lost the battle. There is no cowardice. There is no running away. And again, something that emphasizes Spartan society, this ultra-militaristic state. Very last thing to talk about is just, well, the color red. We always associate red with the Spartans, that they had their shields red, that their uniforms are red and things like that. First off, you do need to know that red dyes were very expensive. They're putting a lot of wealth into how they dress as soldiers. Red dye was actually a very expensive dye at the time, 2,500, 2,800 years ago. But it lent to this idea more of like, well, everybody knew a Spartan soldier was like the best on the battlefield, and a group of them just seemed unbeatable. And the red helped out with this thought process, because if you get wounded and you're bleeding, well, it bleeds into a red tunic. And so it lent even more to this idea of this sense of invincibility and almost like immortal dominators of the battlefield, where it just scared everybody else. And this worked really well for the Spartans, to where they had, I just lost my train of thought. Like, a lot of times they didn't go to war because everybody's too afraid to go to war with them. Now, of course, they do go to war a bunch of times. But anyways, I'm going to end this at this time. I know we're going long, and I'm getting announcements over the thing. There we go.